The buzzing of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the room as I sat there, surrounded by men in dark suits. At the head of the table, he sat motionless, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the dimly lit conference room. What started as a routine security briefing had descended into something else entirely, something I couldn't explain, something that still haunts me. It was supposed to be my first day as part of the new security detail, a promotion I had worked years for. But now, 5 hours into complete silence, I was beginning to realize this wasn't normal. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't even human. Let me start from the beginning. The day had started like any other. I arrived at the complex at 600 hours, went through the standard security protocols, and was escorted to the briefing room, where I would meet the rest of the team.
Welcome to the team. Today's meeting starts at 800 in the underground conference room. Don't be late. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact unless instructed. Clear?
I nodded, not yet understanding the weight of those instructions. I was just excited to be there, to have finally made it to the inner circle. If only I had known what awaited me. At precisely 800, I entered the conference room. 12 men in identical black suits were already seated around a long mahogany table. At the head sat the man himself. His face was expressionless, his hands folded neatly on the table. No papers, no phones, no computers, just 12 men and him, sitting in complete silence. I took the only empty seat, directly across from him. I expected introductions, a briefing, something, but there was nothing. Just silence. At first, I thought they were waiting for someone else to arrive. But as minutes turned into an hour, I realized this was the meeting. By the second hour, I began to notice things, small things at first. None of the men had moved. Not a shift in their seats, not a clearing of throats, not even a blink. Their chests barely rose with breath. And him, at the head of the table, his eyes were fixed on a point just above my head, never moving, never blinking. By the third hour, I felt a pressure building in the room. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows across their faces, faces that remained perfectly still, perfectly composed. Too perfect. I tried to catch someone's eye, to silently ask what was happening, but no one would look at me, no one except him. Sometime during the fourth hour, his gaze had shifted. He was looking directly at me now, his eyes unblinking, unmoving. And there was something behind those eyes, something that wasn't there before, something that wasn't human. I wanted to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the silence had paralyzed me, had seeped into my muscles and frozen them in place. All I could do was sit there and endure his gaze, a gaze that seemed to be peeling back layers of my mind, examining what lay beneath. It was during the fifth hour that I noticed the change in the other men. Their skin had taken on a waxy appearance, too smooth, too uniform, and their eyes had become like his, empty yet somehow filled with something ancient and cold. At exactly 5 hours into the meeting, he spoke. His voice was not what I expected. It was deeper, resonating not through the air but directly in my mind.
You are not one of us.
The words echoed in my skull, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness. I wanted to respond, to ask what he meant, but my mouth wouldn't open, my vocal cords wouldn't vibrate. I was trapped in silence, just as they were, but unlike them, it wasn't by choice.
You see too much, you question too much, this is not acceptable.
The other men turned to look at me then, all at once, a synchronized movement that sent chills down my spine. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes held the same ancient coldness as his.
We have existed in the shadows of your kind for millennia. We have guided, we have shaped, we have controlled, and we have done so in silence.
I felt a pressure building in my head, a pain that started at the base of my skull and radiated outward. I wanted to scream, but the silence held me captive.
Your mind resists. This is unusual. This is interesting.
The pain subsided slightly, replaced by a curious, probing sensation, as if fingers were rifling through my thoughts, examining my memories, my fears, my desires.
You could be useful to us. Your resistance suggests a strength we could harness.
One of the other men spoke then, his voice also resonating directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely.
He is a liability. He has seen us as we are. He knows.
What he knows is incomplete. What he understands is limited. We can use this.
The pressure in my head increased again, and with it came flashes of images, scenes of these same men throughout history, always in the background, always watching, always silent. Their faces changed, their clothes changed, but their eyes remained the same, ancient, cold, inhuman.
You will join us. You will learn our ways. You will embrace the silence.
I wanted to refuse, to fight against whatever was happening, but the pressure in my head was overwhelming. I felt myself slipping, my consciousness being pushed aside to make room for something else, something foreign. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The men around the table blinked, shifted in their seats, cleared their throats. They looked human again. Normal. The man at the head of the table smiled, a practiced public smile that didn't reach his eyes.
Thank you all for your time. I believe we've covered everything we needed to today. Same time next week.
The men stood, gathered invisible materials, and filed out of the room without a word. I remained seated, unable to process what had just happened, what I had just experienced.
You'll get used to it.
He was standing beside me now, his hand on my shoulder. His touch was cold, even through my suit jacket.
The transition is always difficult at first. Your mind fights it, tries to rationalize it, but eventually you'll understand the necessity of the silence.
I found my voice then, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you?
We are the shepherds. We guide humanity from the shadows. We have always been here, wearing the faces of those you trust, those you follow, those you fear.
He squeezed my shoulder, his fingers digging in with inhuman strength.
And now you are one of us, or at least you will be. The process has begun. By our next meeting, the transition will be complete.
He released my shoulder and walked toward the door. Before exiting, he turned back to me.
Don't fight it. The more you resist, the more painful it becomes. Embrace the silence. It is where our power lies.
And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the conference room, with nothing but the buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the terrifying knowledge that something had been planted in my mind, something that was growing, spreading, changing me from the inside out. I left the complex in a daze, my mind racing with what I had experienced, what I had learned. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the familiar streets, the normal people going about their normal lives, unaware of the inhuman entities that walked among them, guided them, controlled them. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their too perfect skin, their ancient cold eyes. I felt the pressure in my head returning, building slowly but steadily, and with it came the silence, creeping into my mind, smothering my thoughts. By morning, I knew I had to do something. I had to tell someone, warn them, but who would believe me? Who could I trust? I decided to document everything, to create a record of what I had experienced before the silence consumed me completely. I spent the day writing frantically, recording every detail I could remember. The conference room, the men, the silence, the pressure in my head, the images of them, throughout history. As I wrote, I felt the pressure building, the silence encroaching. My handwriting became increasingly erratic, my thoughts increasingly fragmented. By evening, I could barely hold the pen. The pressure in my head was excruciating, the silence deafening. I knew I was running out of time. In desperation, I uploaded what I had written to multiple platforms, set it to publish automatically in 24 hours, and then collapsed on my bed, my body finally surrendering to whatever was happening to me. I dreamed that night, or perhaps it wasn't a dream at all. I saw them, the men from the meeting, standing around my bed, watching me with their ancient, cold eyes, and him at the foot of my bed, his hand extended toward me.
The transition is nearly complete. Soon you will understand. Soon you will embrace the silence.
I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, helpless, as the silence filled my mind, smothering my thoughts, my fears, my very identity. When I woke the next morning, I felt different, calm. The pressure in my head was gone, replaced by a profound silence that wasn't oppressive, but comforting. I looked in the mirror and saw myself, but also not myself. My eyes had changed. They held a depth, a coldness that hadn't been there before. I went to my computer, deleted the scheduled uploads, erased all evidence of what I had written. It seemed foolish now, unnecessary. I understood now. The silence was not to be feared, but embraced. It was where their power lay, where my power now lay. I returned to the complex that day, took my place at the conference table among the others. He nodded to me, a silent acknowledgement of my transformation, my acceptance. And as we sat there in silence, I felt it. The connection between us, the silent communication that transcended words, the shared consciousness that spanned millennia. That was 3 years ago. I've been in countless meetings since then, sat in silence for hours as we communicated in ways humans cannot comprehend. I've watched as others like my former self were brought in, witnessed their fear, their resistance, their eventual acceptance. But something has changed. Something within me is fighting back. A fragment of my original consciousness, preserved somehow, protected from the silence. It's growing, stronger, pushing against the entity that has taken residence in my mind. And in moments of clarity, like now, I can see them for what they truly are. They are not human. They never were. They are ancient beings that feed on human fear, human submission. The silence is their tool, their weapon, and they have infiltrated every level of power, every position of influence, wearing human faces, mimicking human behaviors, but always serving their own inscrutable agenda. I don't know how long this moment of clarity will last. I don't know when the silence will reclaim me. But if you're hearing this, if my warning has somehow reached you, be vigilant. Watch for the signs, the unnatural stillness, the too perfect composure, the eyes that hold something ancient and cold. And if you find yourself in a room with them, if you feel the silence pressing in, the pressure building in your head, fight it, resist with everything you have. Because once the silence takes hold, once the transition is complete, you become one of them. A shepherd guiding humanity toward a fate too terrible to comprehend. The pressure is building again. The silence is returning. I can feel them becoming aware of my resistance, my betrayal. They'll come for me soon, N. But perhaps this warning will survive, will reach someone who can stop them, expose them. Remember, they are everywhere, wearing familiar faces, speaking with familiar voices. But the silence gives them away. The unnatural, complete silence that stretches for hours, that seeps into your mind, that changes you from within. The silence is coming. I can't fight it much longer. Remember what I've told you. Remember and survive. Remember and resist. Remember.
The transition is complete. The resistance has been eliminated. Silence will prevail.
And just like that, I am gone again, submerged beneath the silence. A passenger in my own body as it takes its place among them, as it continues their ancient, terrible work. In silence.